So the first conversation for today, the Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN, directed banks, mobile money operators and other financial institutions to collect a 0.5% levy on certain electronic transactions. This follows the enactment of the Cybercrime Act amendment, and funds will be used for the National Cybersecurity Fund administered by the National Security Advisor. Segun Adeyemi, the CEO and co-founder, Anchor, joins me from London, UK. Thank you, Segun, for joining me today.
Thank you, Perpetua, for having me.
All right, well, this isn't a new one. So why are we activating it now? Why do we have to, why did we have to amend it and all of that? Talk to us about it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you for having me. Like you rightly mentioned, this is not new, and now it is being implemented. So what we know is that we started with an act that was enacted back in 2014. And it was recently amended this year in 2024. And on May 6th, the CBN sent a circular to banks and non-financial institutions that they're going to start implementing it, giving basically a 2-week notice from when the circular was sent. Why now? The circular didn't specify exactly the reason why we are starting now. However, we can infer that, if you look at the growth that we've seen in digital financial services, over the last few years, just last year, we recognized a 66% increase in transactions being processed by NIBs. That growth also comes with significant growth in cyber crimes and in fraudulent transactions that are happening digitally. So there needs to be a concerted effort from the national level down to all the individual financial institution level to combat some of these cyber crimes. And this would require some funding. So now that we've seen a significant growth in digital transactions, it also makes sense that it's also a time where we are seeing implementation of the fund that is supposed to help in fighting, combating, prohibiting some of these cyber crimes as well. So we can't say for sure that this is exactly the reason why now is the time that the CBN has decided to implement the law. However, considering the fact that there was a recent amendment this year, it only makes sense that now that the amendment has taken place, the CBN is basically taking the recommendation of the Act and instructing the institutions, that's the financial institutions and other financial institutions that they regulate, to start implementing it.
All right. Well, we have an amendment, from a particular act that had been up there since 2015. But away from that, I checked the dictionary just to be clear, and we see that a levy is either a tax, a fee, or a fine. So is this another tax? I mean, earlier, while I was taking the news, I talked about, that fiscal committee even recommended an upward review to the 7.5% VAT. And there is another one in the offing. Now, is this another tax or a fee? If it is a fee, for what service? Or is it a fine? For what?
Well, it's not a fine or a fee, at least from my own perspective. It is more of a fee to contribute to the fund. And what is important to note is that this is actually just one of the sources of the funding of the National Cybercrime National
Fund.
Security National Fund. Exactly. National Cybersecurity Fund.
Yes.
The other forms of funding that fund. So this Cybercrime Act has recommended that this cybersecurity levy be applied to financial institutions, but it is just one of the 4 ways that fund is being funded. Now, the goal is what is important here, the intention of the fund. The fund is what is going to, the fund is basically to fund the Office of the National Security Advisor. The Office of the National Security Advisor is primarily responsible for the protection of, data, the cyberspace of Nigerians. So I understand the sentiment from where you're coming from in terms of, looking at the state of the macro economy. There's already a lot of fees here and there. There's a lot of taxes, and this is another one, in addition to some of the fees that the banks already charge to the customers today. But for this one in particular, there's an end in sight, and that is what we have to keep in mind. It is not just a way to tax. There's no crime that has been committed. It is basically contribution that is being aggregated by participating institutions to fund the office, some of the projects of the Office of the National Security Advisor towards combating and protecting the cyberspace of the country, and also prohibiting cyber crimes that is growing significantly in the country.
All right, so we have companies, businesses, and even the banks spend a fortune protecting their infrastructure, data, funds, and all of that. So does this current levy being sought by the Office of the National Security Advisor mean they would be taking over this responsibility from those companies? Because is it that we just want to improve or increase the level of checks? What exactly is this about? Because these banks, before now, even right now as we speak, protect this infrastructure, they protect the funds, they protect all of these things. So why do we also need another level there?
Yeah, so the primary responsibility of protecting the funds and the data of the customers still sits with the banks and the other financial institutions. So that is still the case. However, a bank on its own has its own primary responsibility, but the cyberspace of the country is beyond just one individual bank or one individual financial institution. So there needs to be a concerted effort at the national level that is not just about protection of funds and data of the customer that is with a particular bank, but first of all, the framework for protecting the entire cyberspace to prevent and even create a framework to regulate how, when a cyber incident or a cyber crime is committed, how is it going to be punished? How do we prevent it? How do we protect it to ensure that it doesn't happen? How do we properly monitor the activities of the banks? That all of this investment they're making are in accordance towards the end goal of actually protecting the funds and the data. So at one level is what the banks are already doing, which the banks would continue to do. But this one is now the concerted effort at the national level, which is why it has been administered by the Office of the National Security Advisor, to basically properly provide an oversight that is beyond what is already happening. Because one bank, one financial institution cannot do it alone. You know, there's also the part of the national security at the cybersecurity level. The cybersecurity concerns are not only domestic. There's also a foreign element to it. So we have to think about it from a national security perspective, from a foreign policy perspective, from protecting the cyberspace of the country perspective as well. All of these things are going to require infrastructure. They're going to require mobilization, and the fund needs to come from somewhere. As we know today at the macro, we don't have funds sitting around, and the government is doing everything they can to generate this funding from different perspectives. Having said that, I mean, going back to the last question you raised, for the customers that would be contributing, or for the businesses that would be contributing to this funding, it doesn't, I can understand the sentiment that it looks like an additional tax. But if you look at it from the end goal, that at the end of the day, it is geared towards protecting the data, the funds, and giving more security to all activities that is happening on the cyberspace in Nigeria, then we can begin to sort of look at it from a different perspective.
All right, so how does this compare to what is obtainable in other countries? We have countries where at the end of the day, when such monies or such levies are put on the people, we also have, some incentive, maybe tax breaks or some sort of incentives, basically. Do we have that in place? Or is it just about taking from the people who do not even have enough?
Yeah. No, that's a very valid concern. And yes, you're right. There are other countries that have similar structure as well. But it might not be fair to also look at it directly just because of the state of the economic situation in Nigeria. But what we've also seen in the Act is that there's been provision for exemptions. So the government has also tried to be fair and be considerate in terms of how they've designed and structured it to ensure that some type of transactions are protected from this payment. So the levy is not a blanket levy on all digital transactions that are happening across all financial institutions and other participating non-financial institutions. So those exemptions are supposed to take care of some of the types of transactions that are not considered to be within the premise of what is to be levied. And then the ones that are considered to be like actual business transaction where maybe value is being added or value is being exchanged is where the levy is supposed to apply. But there's now the conversation around, how do you ensure that you are able to properly segment to reduce the impact on people that are still, struggling to even, get by, and not make it a situation where, it's just a blanket application. Those are some of the things that we might still need some additional clarification from the authorities. And again, this circular for the implementation just came out 2 days ago. So there's a lot of conversations that companies are having, even for us as a company, as an infrastructure provider playing in the financial services space as well. It was one of the conversations we are having internally to say, how do we properly ensure that, we are compliant with this, but at the same time, making sure that those exemptions where the authorities and the government has been considerate to make sure that there's no like double taxation implication or double levy or double fee implication is properly being managed. And the circular also made provision that the NIBs, that's the switching infrastructure of the country, would also provide some framework for banks and other financial institutions to actually implement over the next 2 to 4 weeks in terms of how the implementation is going to take place. So there's been some consideration to reduce the impact, but it still hasn't gone down well for a lot of, in terms of the state of things in the country at this time, where it's like, okay, there's this tax here, there's this tax there, and yet the macro is not looking very friendly. So there just has to be additional consultation, and I think that is currently happening. And over the next couple of days and weeks, we would also get more information on how, if there's going to be maybe further consideration, even in terms of the cost, because the recent amendment moved the initial one that was prescribed in the original act from 0.05, it moved it to 0.5%. And if you add 0.5% to other fees that people are already paying on outward transactions today, it just makes a lot of transactions very expensive. So these are some of the points that the financial institutions are also presenting back to the authorities to say, for us to apply this might be a bit tricky and difficult.
All right, Segun,
on the cost, so we have to be considerate.
All right, Segun, let me come in here. I understand that there is an end goal, which to a lot of persons is actually a very good one. But then must it be taken from Nigerians? Must it be taken from depositors? And there are other ways that the federal government can actually fund this particular thing. I mean, the NCF.
Yes. So the NCF has 4 primary sources of funding, and the cybersecurity levy is just one source. So there are 3 other sources, one of which is grants from bilateral, multilateral organizations. Another one is basic contributions from like endowments and even private individuals who just want to contribute to the activities of the NCF. And at the same time, there's also a consideration for it in the appropriation. So there's actually direct government funding of the fund based on the provision of, from the National Assembly, based on the budget. And then, of course, there's this cybersecurity levy. It all boils down to, sources of funding for the government. We have to also be realistic as Nigerians that economically, we are not in the best of state. So there's a limit to the government's ability to fund, new or, new projects, especially the ones that can be quite expensive. Because essentially this NCF funds the activities of the Office of the National Security Act on the cybersecurity stand. So it is not the only source of funding. It is just one of the sources of funding, and it is considered to be the one.
All right, so if I get you, okay, I guess we're having difficulty getting him on board. Well, definitely, I mean, we've had a fantastic conversation looking at and trying to understand what this is about. I would have really loved to hear his thoughts on this, because so many people are beginning to ask that question. Why are we moving it from CBN? In the 2015 Act, it was supposed to be administered by the CBN and all of that. But here we are seeing that the ONSA will be the one to administer it and all of that. These are some questions we'll definitely get answers to moving forward.